So Nathan, you think it's time? Should we start? Okay, great. Hello, everyone. Welcome. It's a real pleasure to have you all here today. We're going to be talking about the complex problem of refugee settlement and protection following the keynote by Eric Tang yesterday. My name is Wendy Kozal. I'm a professor of comparative American studies at the college, and I use the pronoun she, her. I will be the moderator today. The goal of this panel is to highlight how different academic disciplines and professional industries can contribute to the potential solutions to this complex problem. The panel will unpack the keynote topic to some extent, but we won't necessarily continue the same conversation. Panelists have been asked to discuss their academic and professional journeys and their pathways to working on issues pertaining to refugee settlement and protection. Each of the panelists will introduce themselves, and then I will be asking questions for about 30 minutes or so, and then there will be time for the students to ask questions either directly by or through the chat. And if you're interested in sending your email, your question through chat, send it to Nathan. Okay, can we begin with Dia?
Absolutely. Good afternoon, everybody. I am here in North Carolina and happy to be with you today. I'm Dr. Dia Abdo, and I'm of refugee background. Was born and raised in Jordan to refugee parents, Palestinian refugee parents, and I'm an immigrant to this country. I'm a professor of English at Guilford College, where I founded and direct a program called Every Campus a Refuge. ECAR for short mobilizes colleges and universities to host refugees on campus grounds and support them in their resettlement. There are several ECAR chapters across the nation. Guilford College is the flagship chapter, and we've hosted 60 refugees on our campus. I'm also the director of the University of North Carolina at Greensboro's Center for New North Carolinians. That center serves annually over 2,000 refugees and immigrants in North Carolina by promoting their access and their integration here in North Carolina. So it's great to be here today. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. And we'll go to Eva next.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Sorry I couldn't get to meet you personally. It's a bit larger group than I thought. When I, like you, was a sophomore at Oberlin, I had no idea of what I wanted to become. I chose my major, sociology, because it gave me a chance to spend a junior semester in Washington, D.C., which fit my love to travel, to meet people, and to dream of making the world a better one. Well, now, near the end of the journey, with its many opportunities and some disappointments, my hope is that you, the next generation, will move that dream forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Eva. Alyssa?
So I'm an attorney working primarily in immigration. That's all I do every day. Law school was not something I thought I would do. when I started my college career, also at a small liberal arts college in Pennsylvania. It was through, my passion my passion and interest for refugees. I had an interest in refugees, when I started my college journey, but I didn't know where that was going to take me. I thought life was going to take me to policy work, and I was going to go to Washington, D.C. and work on refugee policy. And then I had the opportunity to study abroad, and did a study abroad in London, where I ended up with an organization working with Black minority ethnic refugee women. So particularly women's issues, and how women, even within the refugee community, tend to be more disadvantaged. So from there, that's what sparked my interest to eventually go to law school. And that's how I came to work with asylum seekers. I don't do work with refugees just because of the nature of the program, but individuals fleeing their countries for various reasons, economic reasons, natural disasters, political reasons, they end up here one way or another. And sometimes there are other avenues that they're able to seek, and that's where my work comes in, and work of my colleagues working with special immigrant juveniles, refugee, asylum seekers, refugees, when they get to the naturalization stage. We also assist them as well, in that next step of their journey.
Thank you. And finally, Esther?
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me today. I'm so excited to be here in conversation with you. My name is Esther. I'm a PhD candidate in cinema and media studies at the University of Southern California. And I've also had a very kind of nonlinear pathway to get to where I am today. So I actually transferred schools twice as an undergrad, changed my major 4 times, and it took me 6 years to get my bachelor's degree. And I never wanted to go to graduate school. I never wanted to be a teacher. I thought I wanted to work in the entertainment industry, and I was hustling doing music management and music journalism. And by the time I had finished 2 years of community college, because I was out of state, and then I came home to go to community college because it's easier to transfer from there to an in-state school. I just needed to get in and get out. I transferred to the closest school to my mom's house, UC Irvine, saw that they had a major in film and media studies, didn't read what it was, said entertainment, close enough, and then found that it opened up this whole world for me and gave me an entire vocabulary to really express myself and explore things that I had never known how to articulate before. And so my personal interest in media that deals with displacement and migration and refugees is that I'm also an immigrant. I was born in Hungary, and we came to the United States at the end of 1991, just as the Soviet troops, the last Soviet troops, were leaving Hungary, which was part of the Soviet Union. It was a satellite state. And then 10 years later, when I was 11, that's when we had 9/11 in the United States. And so my childhood was bookended by these two kind of ideological wars. And I felt like both of those wars also caused so much displacement and migration in the world. And I felt like I wanted to figure out how I came to be where I am today, but also how we all ended up kind of in the world we're living in. And media has been the lens that's given me the sort of window and the tools to be able to make sense of all these larger complex questions that we're all dealing with. So sorry, that was a very long answer, but
No, thank you all for sharing a little bit about yourselves. It's such an honor and privilege to have you all here today. One of the things that came up in Professor Tang's talk yesterday, and something I think you all deal with, is the common trope on refugee resettlement is the notion of the good refugee. The good refugee is someone we want to take care of, and that of course then presumes that some don't belong. And so what we were wondering if each of you could talk briefly about this trope and how it enters the work that each of you do. Maybe Esther, you could start.
yes, so I would echo a lot of what Eric said yesterday in his keynote about how we have these sort of preconceived notions about how refugees should behave, often through the media narratives that we consume. So we either expect that refugees are going to be kind of these passive, helpless victims that are awaiting our rescue in the host country, and they're going to be complacent and they're not going to push for more rights or be troublemakers. Or often we get these sort of stories of exceptional refugees. So I don't know, maybe some of you remember in 2016, there was a young girl named Yusra Mardini who competed in the first Olympic refugee team. And her backstory was that she had traveled across the Mediterranean Sea in one of these like inflatable rafts, which suffered from engine failure. And after placing distress calls, no one came to save them. And so she and her sister and 2 other people swam for 3 hours in order to kind of alleviate some of the weight in this overpacked inflatable raft. So she became this sort of heroic figure, right? So we have these really exceptional people who we elevate in the media, and then we also have those sort of images of people that we can easily pity who are non-threatening. And we expect, I think, often refugees are going to express gratitude, and then, as Eric was saying, keep their head down and get to work and be helpful to their new host country. But I think what these stories are really, more about, these stories of uplift, these stories of success, they're more about us, in fact, and how we want to feel than they are necessarily about refugees themselves. So they make us feel like we have helped people overcome the odds. We have given people a new safe environment in which to live. And they don't ask us to think about what our own complicity is in these larger structures of violence that have made refugees' home countries unsafe or unlivable. And so this question of, often we, when you read about refugees in the news media, there's this sort of conversation around empathy. We need more empathy. We need to feel more sympathy for these people in order to understand. But there's a difference between, I think, feeling empathy and then asking what our own responsibility is towards refugees, because those are not the same thing. And so part of what I do in my work is try to investigate what these politics are of representation. So what are the political and ethical stakes of consuming all of these images of crisis and humanitarian suffering? And how do media objects actively shape our world, not only culturally, but also in terms of policy as well, in terms of how we come to understand different people and make decisions about how we structure people's lives.
Great, thank you. Alyssa?
So a lot of times in the legal world, we get this aspect of the bad, I'll kind of go to the opposite of that, the bad refugee, the bad immigrant. And we've especially seen it, in recent times where there's this idea that, close the borders, we have enough people here, they're going to take our jobs. So we have this ongoing, they're simultaneously taking all of our jobs, but they're simultaneously also lazy and using the U.S. system, and we're supporting these immigrants. So we've kind of got this dichotomy going on of, so is this refugee somebody who's hardworking and they're coming to take the jobs of U.S. citizens, and therefore we need to close our borders to them. And then the other side of the coin of the refugees that are coming to utilize taxpayer benefits and use the system and be lazy and rely on us. The same notion of the helpless refugee that needs us. So as an attorney, a lot of times we advocate, to kind of shift the conversation, to the benefit that we receive as the United States economically in terms of the employment aspect of it. For each refugee, the U.S. Gains an economic benefit. So not only are we, it's kind of an exchange. So in exchange for this assistance that we're providing, we're also receiving an economic benefit, because it's been shown that refugees, when they come in, they bring their culture. They actually increase employment in the United States. So. And then as well, we've got this aspect of the bad refugee, and, in any society, there are individuals who commit crimes. So is the crime, is the punishment fitting the crime that we don't want refugees to come here because they might commit petty crimes, where a U.S. citizen, somebody who's here, that's a minor punishment that they would receive. Whereas a refugee, if we're thinking about expelling them from the protections of the United States, is the punishment of, the risk of death going back to their country that they've sought refuge from, really fitting the crimes that have occurred. So there's this advocacy on the part of attorneys, largely, that we kind of frame it in other ways for people that don't quite think about it in that aspect.
Thank you. That was great. Eva, do you want to respond to this?
Sure. My take is a little different. Frankly, I never heard of it in the course of my work, and that's been a long time, either in academics or at the United Nations, or my work as a advocacy committee for people on the move in the United Nations. I never heard of it in the course of my work, that term, and I didn't experience it as a refugee myself. And just as a quick responder to what I have heard now so far, I would say that this is something that is not limited to refugees. It's not limited. That's how, unfortunately, many people in the world see foreigners, and but migrants as well as refugees, et cetera, which is, I think, very unfortunate, and which is something we have to do about, but it is certainly not limited to refugees. It involves also our attitude to race and so forth and so on. And frankly speaking, the term itself was my first encounter with it was in Professor Tang's book. And it made me curious by whom the term was first coined and how common a trope it really is. Thank you.
Thank you. That was really interesting. Thank you. Do you have any final thoughts?
Yeah. I want to say that I echo that the narrative of the good versus the bad refugee is twinned with the xenophobic narrative of the bad versus good immigrant, right? It's a racist narrative that's fomented by anti-refugee, anti-immigrant ideologies, policies, practices, and discourses that I think seek to destroy the solidarity between local communities of color and new Americans of color. So I'm speaking from my own perspective as someone who works with refugees and immigrants in this country. It's a sort of classic divide and conquer, distracts folks from the real causes of their oppression, and making them focus instead on fabricated causes, right? The loss of job or the loss of employment or whatever, right? The bad refugee is going to steal your job, your housing. There are lots of myths that refugees don't really need to leave their country, that they're cowards. Why didn't they stay and fight? They do have enough money. They have cell phones. So this is all untrue. The focus should be on the fact that there are enough resources in this country. They're just not being shared equitably by people in power or people who hold those resources. So this is part of this myth of scarcity, right? Blaming the bad refugee and immigrant for additional scarcity keeps people from radical resistance, from radical solidarity and collaboration. So the way that enters my work is that I emphasize, first of all, that the myth of scarcity is a myth, and that we need to share, redistribute the resources at our disposal, especially institutional resources, in ways that are equitable. And so that's what my work focuses on, is how do we use our institutional resources, especially as institutions of higher ed, in ways that accord with our accountability and responsibility and not just our empathy.
To follow that, take that a little further, Dia. Thinking about pushing the notions of ethics and responsibility, your initiative, Every Campus a Refugee, was founded at a Quaker school in the southern US. And I'm wondering how those values have shaped the program, and thinking about if we're going to push against those myths of scarcity and acquisitive notions of us versus them, what other kinds of values do we bring to or do you advocate that we bring to the table?
Right. So I think there's a lot to say there, because I'm speaking, from a Quaker institution perspective. Quakers themselves have been really involved in refugee support and resettlement, and the Quaker values of especially justice and stewardship, right? So you have resources. How do you steward those resources in ways that are just and right and good and equitable? I'm in the South, and so there's obviously a significant history of civil rights resistance, but also segregation and racism. Guilford College stands next to a woods that was part of the Underground Railroad, and the Quakers who lived nearby used to smuggle the slaves who were escaping in the woods up north. So it's kind of in our DNA to be a place of refuge for folks escaping dispossession and displacement, and supporting them in the next step of their journey. But to speak to issues of accountability, we have to also acknowledge that institutions of higher learning are predominantly white, exist within white systems, and within larger political systems that have disenfranchised other countries, as Esther mentioned, that we are responsible for, accountable for the policies that have displaced people around the world and have made them refugees. And so not just to be righteous and say, this is something we should do because we're good people and we're Quakers, but this is something we have to do because we've inherited this country's policies.
Thank you so much. Eva, if we could turn to your work at the United Nations, which takes a global focus. I know that you work with both formally recognized and unrecognized refugees. Could you expand on the distinctions between these groups?
Well, I will try, and I'm asking, it requires a little bit of history and a little bit of patience on the part of all of you, please. Um, you know that the UN was founded in 1945, shortly after the end of World War II, at a time when millions of people were displaced persons in dire need of protection. One of the first acts of member states was to establish a refugee agency and to negotiate the 1951 Refugee Convention. Now, this convention, together with its 1967 protocol, which broadened its application, it's the key legal document defining who is a refugee, the rights of refugees, and the legal obligations of states respecting refugees. And the convention spells out the criteria that have to be met to be designated as a bona fide refugee, namely a person who is outside his or her country of nationality, has a well-founded fear of persecution because of his or her race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group or political opinion, and is unable or unwilling to avail himself or herself of that country's protection. And the cornerstone of protection is the principle of non-refoulement, or that refugees cannot be pushed back to their countries of origin. So, according to the Refugee Convention, a person is automatically a refugee when he or she meets the definition of this term. But to be assured of protection and non-refoulement, it is important that his or her refugee status is formally acknowledged by the refugee agency or member states. Keeping that in mind, let's fast forward to your lifetime to 2015 and the refugee crises as a result of the Syrian civil war, exacerbated by the war in Afghanistan and the situation of displaced persons in Africa. This led here in New York in 2016 to a United Nations high-level meeting on large movements of refugees and migrants, and the adoption of the New York Declaration for Refugees and Migrants, which mandated negotiation of 2 global compacts. Both have been adopted 2 years ago and since then are in the process of implementation, namely the Global Compact for Refugees and the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration. The Compact for Refugees basically updates and extends the protection of refugees as defined in the Refugee Convention. The Migration Compact, for the first time, calls for protection for all those persons who are on the move across borders, especially those vulnerable and in vulnerable situations, those who move to find work and to pursue an education, those who migrate for purposes of family reunification, those who are forced to flee to alleviate significant hardships that arise from famine, extreme poverty, or natural disasters. So, while refugees and migrants are entitled to the same universal human rights and fundamental freedoms, the Migration Compact considers them distinct groups governed by separate legal frameworks. And the Migration Compact states explicitly that only refugees are entitled to the specific international protection as defined by the international refugee law. Furthermore, the agreement states explicitly that the Global Compact for Migration presents a non-legally binding cooperative framework that builds on the commitments agreed to by member states voluntarily in the New York Declaration for Refugees and Migrants. And follow-up, therefore, depends on the voluntary exercise of member states' humanitarian obligations. What these specifications mean, concretely speaking, is that many of those forced to flee their countries of origin, as well as those encountering vulnerable situations in their home countries in transit and destinations, especially children, fall through the cracks of a protection system that they desperately need. So to sum it up regarding the protection needs, we have 1, persons who meet the Refugee Convention's criteria of refugee and who are officially recognized as such and eligible for protection as such. Second, persons who meet the convention's criteria, but they are not officially recognized as refugees, and more often than not deprived of the protection accorded to refugees. And third, persons who are not refugees, but who are in desperate need of protection because of their vulnerable situations in countries of origin, transit, and destination. So I hope that you get the picture. It's a little complicated, but basically my concern is with people, and I hope yours, is with people who need protection, people on the move who need protection, regardless of what their particular title is, but the particular title makes a difference in whether they can get protection or not. Thank you.
Thank you, Eva. That was actually very clarifying. Alyssa, Dr. Sanders talked about this issue from a global perspective through the lens of her work at the UN. Can you discuss the point at which lawyers in the US would get involved in an asylum case, for example, and what that looks like?
So Eva kind of touched on it with her points 2 and 3. These individuals who meet the definition of a refugee but aren't granted that particular refugee status, and then these third group of individuals who are really in need of assistance but don't quite meet that definition or receive the protection. So there are other legal frameworks here in the United States for individuals who may be needing of protection of the United States, who both meet the definition of a refugee or otherwise perhaps don't quite meet the definition, but are in situations that they're at risk if they return to their home countries. So Eric Tang yesterday kind of mentioned this framework of asylum seekers here in the United States, and he did briefly distinguish asylum seekers from refugees. But in addition to that, we have other frameworks such as special immigrant juveniles. So these are young persons fleeing situations in their home countries, where they need assistance in the United States, and that they can avail themselves of that system, as well as temporary protected status. So for individuals where the United States has recognized that perhaps an individual can't return to their country of origin immediately, but they foresee that situation is a short-term situation where these individuals, the goal is for these individuals to eventually return to their home country. And that would be situations of, for example, disasters like happen in Nepal. You have mudslides, tsunamis, earthquakes, that would prevent someone from returning to their home eventually, but it's not to the level that there's political instability that would prevent them from eventually returning. So where attorneys here in the United States come into play is at various points in the process for these individuals, either seeking legal status here in the United States. They are arriving, they want to stay within the framework of the U.S. immigration system and quote unquote do it the right way. There are other times where asylum seekers are here because they're seeking refuge in the United States, but they try to fly under the radar because the United States has gained this reputation that we do not have the most sympathetic asylum system here in the United States. And in fact, depending on which state you're in, we do see a disparity in the granting of asylum for individuals. Sometimes you could have the same circumstances for an individual who receives a different outcome depending on the asylum officer that you receive and subsequently the immigration court system that they end up in. So we have this disparity countrywide where asylum seekers do not want to avail themselves of the protection of the United States. They want to be here, but they don't want to end up in a system that is going to eventually fail them. I also mentioned special immigrant juveniles. So as I mentioned previously, my work is primarily immigration, but we also rely on, for example, family courts. We rely on family counselors, individuals who are working in the family system for these young people who come into the country who are needing of assistance and refuge, depending on what their circumstances are. They're not always necessarily within the definition of a refugee, but their country circumstances are such that the situation to be returned to is not one that we don't want to send them back to. So various aspects, criminal attorneys come into play at various aspects as well. As I mentioned, we have sometimes people are here in the system, they come as a youth. I've worked with refugees who come as young children with their parents, and by virtue of trying to assimilate to the U.S. culture, they find themselves in situations that many young people do, where they have minor legal infractions, and therefore, attorneys need to work with them with the special lens in mind that they don't receive quite the legal consideration that a U.S. citizen would, for example. So we come at this at various angles, both asylum seekers, temporary protected status, special immigrant juveniles, and then sometimes unique situations where a refugee is here or an asylum seeker is here and finds an employer who wants to petition for them. And then we search for legal options within that framework of the U.S. employment immigration system, or they have family or they've married a U.S. citizen, and we can seek options and avenues through the family-based immigration system. So a lot of times we come up with unique situations and solutions for individuals who are seeking refuge depending on what their particular circumstances are.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much. That was really illuminating. I think given the time, I'm going to ask one last question to Dia and Esther, and then open it up for student questions. So there's plenty of time for students. So Dia and Esther, you both are currently working in higher education, and we're likewise in a higher education situation here. So we're wondering what advice you can give to undergraduate students who want to be involved with addressing these challenges associated with refugee status while they're still in school. Esther, do you want to go first? That's fine. Go ahead.
Sure, absolutely.
Thank you.
So I think I want to say to students, please know, recognize, acknowledge your power as a student. I've been teaching in higher ed for the past 23 years. And I've been in plenty of situations, contexts, experiences where the people who have moved the needle on something have been students. I believe they are the most powerful group on campus. So recognize that you have that power, and recognize that you are part of a resource-rich institution. So even though some institutions might say, but we don't have this or have that, sure. I mean, think flexibly, nimbly about what we mean when we say resources. So housing is a resource. Human resources are resources. Your career center is a resource. Every campus of refuge really mobilizes any kind of resource that supports human access to services, development, attending to people's interests and passions. So every campus of refuge has a lot of things that it does to support the resettlement efforts of refugees, and almost all of them are cost-free, but leverage resources that we have on campus already there that exist. So I want you to think about that. I want you to think about how your institution, Oberlin or otherwise, have resources that can support existing and new refugee communities, that can allow them to access basic needs or educational needs or personal needs. You can also support with important advocacy, consciousness raising, awareness raising about the realities that refugees face and the challenges there are in refugee resettlement. The US refugee resettlement system needs help, right? And it needs clarity. And we need to, I think once people understand how refugees are resettled and what kind of support that they get, it's an important piece, because people think that refugees actually get a lot of support and they don't. You can also volunteer or intern with your local refugee serving organizations. There are many of them in every state, whether through service, whether through research, whether through training. And I am happy to answer any specific questions about people's interests, but there's a lot that you can do as a student within and without your institution.
Yeah, I would echo everything that Dia just said. And I would also say, we have such a wonderful opportunity while we're at university to be able to bring different communities together into shared spaces. So doing things like, if you're part of a student organization, you might have some funding, you might be able to program a film screening series that raises these issues in a way that's like very sort of tangible or legible to a lot of different people, and bring in speakers or bring in panels to continue the conversation. If you have language skills, as Dia was saying, volunteering is an amazing thing to do, whether as a translator, interpreter, or whether you just want to help people practice their English skills once they've been resettled. That's something that a lot of organizations are seeking volunteers for. Sometimes you can just do simple things like looking up what businesses employ or support refugees and immigrants, and ordering your food from them or shopping with them. And also I would say that reading is an activity, staying informed is an activity, talking to people, having conversations, taking classes, those are all active things that we're doing that help build the foundations for us to then move forward and continue working as we go through our lives. So don't feel that you're not doing anything by reading or taking classes. You are learning, you're building a strong toolkit for yourself to be able to then figure out what it is that you want to do with your skill sets. So yeah, just keep on pushing forward, I'd say.
Great, thanks so much. This has been great. I know we have more questions we could ask, but I'm sure the students also have lots of questions, and I wanted to make sure there was plenty of time for them to be able to interact with you. So Nathan, how best to handle this?
Let's begin. If folks have, if you want to use the raise hand feature to kind of get in the queue to ask your question directly, please feel free to do that. And if you would feel more comfortable sending your question to me and then posing it that way, we can do that as well. I just got a question via chat that I can share. We have a student asking about if one or more of the panelists want to talk about the U.S. Cap on refugees that are allowed into the country and what your thoughts are on that.
Anybody want to just, yeah, go ahead, Dia.
Right. So, you know, the cap has, the US resettles less than 1% of the refugee population that's eligible for resettlement. We already resettled a very small number of refugees, but that number plummeted from over 100,000 to a historic low recently under the Trump administration. It was 18,000 last year. Only half of those were actually resettled in the U.S. And there was going to be a proposed new low of 15,000. The Biden has promised to reverse those decisions and to increase the refugee resettlement admission or refugee admission cap to, I think, 125,000, if I'm not mistaken, but I might be. And so, I mean, that's my comment on that, is that we should absolutely increase our numbers. I feel that even at their highest, they're very low.
Can I say something?
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, it's just an addition to what you said right now, but I mean, it's been shameful what has happened in terms of during the last 4 years, minimally. Wasn't that good before with regard to the refugee program. But I just wanted to mention, I didn't have time to send it on to you, Nathan, so that some students might be interested in it. You know that my field is not directly either refugee, certainly not resettlement and not in the US, but I get the stuff in the larger context. And there's just a new thing that came out a week ago from the Center for Migration Studies here in New York, together with the Refugee Council. It's called Charting a Course to Rebuild and Strengthen the U.S. Refugee Admissions, which is resettlement program. And what it does is really tell you not only what the program was like, but where it should be going now under the new administration. And it might be of interest to those of you who are thinking of working in this field. So I thought I'd mention it.
Thank you. We had a question from another student asking Esther to speak more about cinema studies background and how that's influenced her work. And maybe I would add on to that, thinking about the ways in which if arts and media impact the way refugees are viewed, which is, you know, we talked a little bit about, how might we all be more critical consumers of media narratives of refugee experiences?
Thank you for that question. I think I'd start by saying that the media and cinema and media studies moves beyond what we traditionally think of as media entertainment. So movies or film, TV, social media, and it thinks about, you know, a broad range of objects from everything like body scanners at airports to surveillance imagery to biometric data to maps and data visualizations. All of that is media that we consume and interact with. And I work from the position that media is not just representational, it's also productive. So in other words, it doesn't simply reflect our world to us, it takes an active role in shaping our environments. So if we begin from the premise that media is productive and not just representational, it allows us to think differently about how concepts like migrant, refugee, citizen, borders come into being and how they're performed in our day-to-day lives. So if we take borders for an example, right? Borders are not naturally existing entities. A border only exists when someone creates a checkpoint and then demands a passport or your ID from you. And that ID is also a media object, right? So it mediates information about who you are, where you're from. It has to have the right formal aesthetics to be able to do that mediating work. So it has to have the right paper stock. It has to have the right hologram under your image. It has to have the right font. In order to get you across that border checkpoint. And if you don't have access to that media object, and if you don't have documentation about who you are, then you might suddenly be seen as suspicious. You might be seen as a criminal. You might be detained. And so that's like one very tangible way in which actually all of us are affected by media objects all the time, right? But if we like return back to the idea of how arts and media kind of in the classic sense of narrative films or documentaries influence how refugees are treated, I think they play a very significant role in shaping our assumptions of how refugees should behave, right? And like what a properly sympathetic refugee looks like, as I was saying earlier. And I think what we need to keep in mind is that refugees themselves are also aware of these mediating tropes and how they have to perform them in order to gain access to the resources they need. So Eva was saying earlier when she was defining what the legal definition of a refugee is for us, that it's based on having a well-founded fear of persecution, right? But how do you prove a well-founded fear? Particularly if you're lacking the documentary evidence that you would need that a lawyer would be able to present in court on your behalf. If everything is based on your testimony, then what are the cultural codes for expressing fear, sadness, trauma, et cetera, that you have to be able to convincingly sort of display for your interpreter, who then might be coming from a very different cultural background and might have a different understanding of what those emotions look like. That's a very intense, sort of framework in which to have to think about how you're moving about your survival. And so I think in terms of our role, in terms of how we can be more critical of what types of media we consume, part of that is sort of doing this difficult work of processing our own feelings as we're consuming these images for me. So I like to kind of turn the mirror back on ourselves and think about, as we're feeling whatever emotions we're feeling when we consume these narratives, what are the narrative and aesthetic choices that are being made in order to encourage those feelings within us, encourage those particular emotional responses within us. Because very often I think the media says more about us than what we desire than it says about other people. And we should also be mindful, right, of like, what are the production conditions in which any type of media is being made? So the easiest way of saying that is to say, like, who is speaking and on behalf of whom are they speaking? And if we can do that kind of, thinking as we're consuming these stories, we can start to think about ourselves in relationship to other people in the world instead of just as observers or voyeurs or people who are getting to make the decisions about who is non-threatening, who is suspicious, who is criminal, so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
You want to go with the raised hand here, Tessia?
Sure, yeah, great. Tessia?
Hi, my name is Tessia. I use she, her. I want to thank all of the panelists for speaking with us today. It's been really, really interesting conversation and really helpful to keep processing what we heard yesterday. My question, I think, might be, might probably merits its own whole conversation, which we might not have time to get into. So, and I've been trying to think of like if this is really, I don't know if relevance is the right word, but anyway, I'll say it and we can see if it makes sense. But this past semester, I was thinking a lot about and studying indigenous populations within the United States and globally. Sorry. And I was wondering how, in terms of like the language that we're discussing of how refugees are defined, and just talking in general about displaced people or people who are in environments where they are not safe, not comfortable, not being provided the resources they need, how discussions of indigenous populations who've been displaced within the land that they traditionally live in factor into that conversation, and if they're part of the discussion in any way.
It's a great question. It's a big question, but does anybody want to tackle at least part of it?
Do you want to go first, and then maybe I'll jump in after you?
I don't know how much to say, except that there's a term for that called the internally displaced individuals, right? So there are folks who leave their towns, their villages, their tribes, their hometowns, and find themselves displaced elsewhere for a variety of reasons. It could be conflict, tension, could be climate disasters, it could be, ethnic cleansing, it could be, so there is a term for internally displaced. I don't know that we use it necessarily to speak about indigenous people of this country as internally displaced. When I say internally displaced, I think, for example, of the Syrians who are internally displaced in Syria. I think it's definitely worth thinking about, and we should be thinking about the ways in which we have displaced the indigenous people of this land, and where they belong in these conversations.
So it's an excellent question, Tessia. Thank you for asking it. And I would say one thing we have to keep in mind is that the legal definitions that we have to work with in the framework of policy and law are in themselves often very limiting and don't correspond to how people actually feel about themselves. And in kind of the field of arts and media, there's more flexibility and more interest in pushing what those definitions are and thinking about the overlaps and the kind of instability of them. So, someone might show up and say, I'm a refugee, and never be given that legal status, but they truly proclaim that identity for themselves. And as things are changing in the world, we also have to think about how we define these different terms, because the concept of the refugee is directly tied to World War II, but it doesn't take into account things that are happening in our world now, like climate change, which is going to create climate refugees. It doesn't take into account a lot of other issues that are going to displace people in ways that hadn't been conceptualized in those political frameworks. So one thing I will say is I work with a professor at USC who's really amazing, named Olivia Harrison. And she's written a book on transcolonial identification, where she's talked about how experiences of colonization that are different, but kind of under this larger shared umbrella of imperialism, have allowed for really interesting solidarity work. So she looks at the question of Palestine in North Africa, France, and then Palestine itself, and how this transcolonial identification takes place, or how Palestine gets taken up as a particular question in order to mobilize other forms of like decolonial efforts. And now she's moved into this question of indigeneity, and she's looking at how ideas of being indigenous are also being used as a political identity around which we can organize, and how people are looking to build these kind of bridges across experiences of indigeneity, of being an immigrant, of being a refugee, so on and so forth. And so what I'm trying to say is I think there's a lot of exciting work being done about how we can mobilize these different words, not in a legal framework, because in the legal framework, we're pretty bound to sort of, strict scripture, but in a kind of exploratory, artistic, and political organizing medium in order to push the boundaries of what our laws currently are.
Great, thank you. Ava has a question.
Yeah, again, I'm also not sure if this one is going to make a lot of sense when I ask it. So if there's any clarification needed, please let me know. But I was just wondering, you guys talked a little bit about the kind of like construction of anti-migrant and like anti-refugee narratives that are based in like racism and colonialism. And I was just wondering if there are like other kind of systemic prejudices that are an important part of this issue, and how to kind of given the like inaccuracies of those tropes and arguments, how to kind of like deconstruct anti-immigrant narratives. I don't know, or anti-refugee narratives. I don't know if that makes sense.
Anybody want to take this? And we will have to wrap it up after this question. So any other final thoughts anybody wants to add? I'm sorry, Theo.
I'll jump in really quickly. Thank you, Ava, for your question. It's also a really excellent one. Yeah, there are like a ton of different kind of frameworks that impact how both conceptions of sort of the bad migrant, or like what informs anti-migrant positions, how those get formed, and then what the good migrant is. And I think I'm going to answer your question in a roundabout way, which is to say that I think oftentimes when those of us who take a pro-migration stance or pro-refugee stance try and argue against those anti-migrant narratives, we end up bringing in these statistics or these arguments about how, yes, of course, like immigrants and refugees, they help boost our economy, they contribute all these different things. We, again, bring in those stories of the exceptional or the, you know, particularly successful refugees who have built huge businesses or employed all these people. And while all those things are true, we have to be careful that we don't inadvertently draw distinctions between, you know, people who are able-bodied, people who are educated, people who are entrepreneurial as somehow more desirable than the refugees and migrants who don't appear useful to us in some way. So it's a question of like, how are we defining who is valuable or what life is valuable? And I think rather than making these arguments about why we should let more people in, I think, again, I'm asking the question of what's our complicity and what's our responsibility to other people in the world? What is our role in shaping the environment through our foreign policy, through the fact that we all pay our taxes and those taxes are used to fund the military, or they're used to make, you know, weapons manufacturing and arms deals that then perpetuate war in other places, or, you know, whatever, big oil and gas causing climate change. Like those are all things that we don't want to participate in, but we're kind of forced to participate in by nature of how our system is set up. And so I think if we turn the conversation more to what is our shared responsibility to each other as human beings, as a species living on the planet, we can start to then think about how do we make structural changes that are going to allow for the redistribution of resources that Dia was speaking about earlier.
Can I say something?
Very briefly, because
Yes, it's very brief. Very brief. I just want to say, I think we should focus more on how what actions we can take to help the people who are in need of support, rather than focusing only on narratives and things like that. We have to pull together the people from different groups you know, to work together for something like this. And it's not just a matter of ideology. And the final thing I only want to say is, because a lot of you asked, what could you do? A lot you can do, as Didia said, both as a group and individually. But I urge you to remember one thing, that the most important thing to remember is the kind of person you are, and that will make the difference.
It's a lovely note to end on. I'm going to thank all of the panelists for your time and your passions and your commitments. And it's just a pleasure to meet you all. And to thank the students for all of their questions and their attention.
Bravo.
And yes, hopefully we can begin to do some of this work together. So best of luck to everybody. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.